Next is our panel discussion, which is going to be on data for impact. And my panelists and my moderator is ready to roll. So ladies and gentlemen, let's keep clapping till we see all of them on stage here. Let's bring on stage Jim, who is going to be our moderator. We have Busoyi, who is the president of BOA Systems. We have Chris Pinotti, executive director of digital impacts from CARE, and then Zainab, who is an AI lead at NRC. Ladies and gentlemen, here you are with your panelists and moderator, Jim.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about sort of AI. It's a hot topic, and one of the reasons that AI is so powerful is that when we build large data sets, and in the commercial industry, there's 5 companies that have a data on 1 billion people. In the social goods sector, we have 1 million tiny silos of that data. If we're going to unlock that potential, we're going to have to find a way to do data sharing. And joining me, we have 3 leaders who are actually doing and advocating for data sharing in the real world with NGOs, in communities, engaging them. They have a lot of lessons to learn, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves and tell you why they're passionate about data sharing. Zainab, do you want to go ahead and, yeah, there's a mic right there.
Thank you, Jim. Hi, I'm Zainab. I'm the AI lead at the Norwegian Refugee Council, and I'm also spearheading the efforts around CLEAR initiative, which is also trying to build the digital backbone to support data sharing across how we respond to humanitarian disasters. As you all know, you mentioned it as well, there is a lot of siloed efforts in how we assess needs after disaster onset. And we are looking into how we can build partnerships and an ecosystem that supports doing this in less fragmentation and more joint efforts.
Hi, my name is Busoyi Anifalaje. I'm from BAO Systems, the president there. And I want to give you a picture of what we do so you can see the context of data sharing. We have over 450 servers that we host. Most of them are DHIS2 implementations. That represents about 100 partners. That's international NGOs, national governments, donor agencies, large private organizations that are manufacturing commodities for development. And this cuts across over 85 countries. We've been doing this for over 10 years. And we have a thought experiment. If you think about the level of data that we're collecting, it goes all the way from sort of national level aggregated data to individual level patient data. It's agriculture, it's health strengthening, it's humanitarian development, multi-sectoral, and doing this for over 10 years. We have a wealth of data. But because of the social contract and perhaps contractual obligations we have, there is no way that we can even propose a world in which we abstract that data, aggregate it, so that each of the organizations that work with us can extract value from this data. 1, in terms of coordination, and 2, also in terms of insights into either the programs they're working on specifically, which could be vertical, or the countries they're working on for better collaboration. But we have already cleared 2 trust barriers. 1, on the technology side, they actually trust the technology that we provide and are happy to host with us. And 2, the organizational trust. They trust us as an organization that we're only custodian of the data and we do not own the data. So there is nothing we can do, and data sharing is so sensitive that internally we talk about the value proposition of aggregating all this data and providing it back to our clients and our partners. But because of the sensitivity of it, we do not even have the courage to broach it with our clients because they might freak out. Like, you know, what are you planning to do? Is this another way of extracting value as a company? So these are some of the challenges, and this is why I'm passionate about, because perhaps this might resonate with some of you who are clients here, and maybe you will instigate that conversation, and then we can look at a framework or a governance structure that helps us to actually start that conversation of sharing data across organizations, ministries, and donor agencies. Thanks.
Sounds great.
Cool. Hi, I'm Christian Panati, and I work for CARE. I lead something called the Digital Impact Hub, which means that we work with all of our program teams, health, education, food security, et cetera, on how are we, number one, helping everyone get online, get access to digital tools, get the agency and the wherewithal to be able to use those in safe ways. And number two, how are we improving the quality of digital products and services so that they're actually reaching the people that we're trying to support and serving them and helping meet their needs in sustainable ways. Where that relates to today's conversation is obviously a lot of the promise of ICT4D and these tech solutions is that this is going to be a more cost-effective way of delivering some of these things, whether it's access to information or services or diagnostics. This is going to enable us to reach more people for less dollars per person, essentially. And when I say us, I don't necessarily mean my institution. I mean everyone in the room. I mean the governments that are driving this kind of change. So I think for us, there's a lot of imperative to really interrogate things like cost effectiveness around those solutions. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing on cost effectiveness, which is one place where I think we're getting good traction on data sharing and learning some hard-won lessons. But I also think, Jim's point about all of us think our data is important and special, but we are tiny in contrast to the ecosystems in which we're operating. And the data that we do have access to is in many ways unique, but it's very fragmented, it's very siloed. And so I would like to help people like you have confidence to say, guys, you each have 10,000 data points or 100,000 data points, but between you have 10 million. Which one's more interesting? And so how do we actually work towards building the systems and the trust necessary for that data to become the sort of asset and the power that it could be, not just for us, certainly not mostly for us, mostly for the communities and the people that we're trying to work with. So that's why I'm here.
Well, I think we've hit a lot of the key issues. This idea of trust is so key. I think we've already heard about that. And also that it's hard to do data sharing, that there's a lot of institutional reasons, practical reasons, political reasons, legal reasons, contractual reasons to not share data. So I think it'll be really interesting, to the extent you're willing to share, because I know sometimes this is confidential stuff. Can you talk about an interesting data sharing effort where multiple organizations brought their data sets together that were convinced that was worth doing, and what went well and what could have been even better if?
Yes.
So you want to go first?
I can go with the proviso that the Ministry of Health is Wakanda. It exists, but it is the Wakanda Ministry of Health. And with this government ministry, we started on the premise that there are multiple partners working in very similar areas, but collecting different types of variations of the same thing. And the ministry was very keen that as the owner of the data, that they wanted all the data to be centralized to minimize duplication of effort, to reduce the burden on healthcare workers, to reduce the cost of multiple partners collecting the same thing. So if you know that one partner is collecting it, rather than you collecting the same thing, you just have access to it. Now, I would start with what didn't actually work. Centralizing data at scale for a large Ministry of Health like Wakanda is very challenging. It's challenging not just on the sort of governance and the political side, but it's also challenging on the technical side. Because if you're looking at 1 billion data points, if anybody has worked with DHIS2, you know that that is really stretching the performance of the system. And so with all the goodwill in the world, and people started dumping their data into this centralized database, this one, the platform started bulking and suffered degradation of performance, and no one was happy. I think everyone went out slightly jaded about this idea. Here comes the technology. We developed a platform that allows you to differentiate between an operational system and a system of record where you can extract data for analytical purposes. That was one thing. The second thing was we managed to convince the ministry that all the data doesn't need to live in the same place. You can work on interoperability and standards that allow you to share data across multiple platforms. Again, the platform was able to do this. And now I could say all is well and people are sharing data. People are still collecting data in their own systems, but where there is overlap, that is centralized. And if they need more, they collect it in their own. And the sharing is going pretty well right now. And the last count, and I can actually just check live feed, the server is still up. So.
Okay, so one database to rule them all, not always a great idea. There's a difference between operational databases, systems that you're running your organization on, and other systems where you might be doing data analytics or training in AI. What are the benefits that Wakanda got from doing this? In other words, if the head of the ministry looks back and says, we did this, and now what's the political payoff to the communities, to the nation, for doing this level of data sharing?
The coordination has been incredible. I think on the back of this, you have a forum where all the partners are actually meeting on a quarterly basis, talking about their data needs, talking about how they can coordinate and reduce the duplication of effort. And I think the main benefit of this is also to the health workers that are having to collect that data for multiple partners, the same thing sometimes on different forms. That has all been eradicated to a greater extent. I would have loved to see a pooling of funds where funds aren't being directed to each program, but funds pooled so that it's also coordinated. That hasn't quite happened yet, but I think we'll take the wins we have now in terms of the coordination of partners, less duplication, and less burden on the health workers.
That sounds great. I know anyone who's been a health worker, data entry is the thing that you live for, right? That's why you became a health worker, so you could do more data entry, right? I think it's a great thing. Zainab, do you want to highlight anything from the experience of your organization? Is there anything you want to surface as an experience that either went well or could have been even better if?
Yeah, no, I just want to share, like from the humanitarian aid response perspective, we're dealing with data that is slightly different from development. And really, when it comes to operational data, with the data that we need to deliver aid as effectively as possible, there is a lot of, you talked about data colonization, there is really a lot of extractivism when it comes to needs assessment. Basically, what happens when a disaster hit, all of us go there, all of us ask a lot of questions to communities that are already under a lot of stress. We ask those questions end up in some server, it takes some time until it's processed, until it's cleaned, until it's ready for sharing. And sharing, again, is happening way down the line of the data life cycle, and it's not happening while the data is actually operational. So we do a lot of after the fact data processing and sharing, and that's really a lot of waste of efforts. Given the fact that we are, yesterday everybody talked about funding crisis, there is an imperative for sharing. We can no longer continue doing the same data collection and processing. We need to start looking into approaches that help us do this in a more collaborative way. One of the challenges, I mean, you all mentioned the technology, the people, the organization, but also it's really about incentives. Most of the time, organizations don't really have the incentives to share while they're responding, and they don't have the capacity, and therefore that's just not happening. Often data is really treated as something, everybody wants data, but nobody invests in data. It's really not looked at as a strategic asset from an organization perspective. It's, again, we're an ICT for the conference. It's looked at as an ICT initiative, but it's beyond that. It is, of course, related to technology. It's about using technology that is permissive for sharing, but also we do have a lot of governance, digital governance. We talk about AI governance, but it very much stays at the policy theoretical level. It doesn't really get to practical. How do we actually make it actionable? And that is about investing in people, in the right technology, in open source technology that actually allows especially local actors to tap into the data and not need a license to get into the data. So I really believe that this is the time for change and for bringing efforts together, especially when it comes to AI. Again, it's quite extractive, we all know that. We talk about AI sovereignty from a very high level, but it really goes down to if we're collecting data from communities and then using that to inform our action or to inform our fundraising, we need to have data lineage that brings back those insights, at least the insights back to the communities so that they can also help themselves. And this is one of the efforts that we are trying to also work on within CLEAR. It's quite a rough road, but at least we got funding for the next 3 years, so that we're very hopeful that we can build, also using the new technology that allows us to have federated governance, federated data infrastructure that doesn't need everyone to align on everything, but we can designate certain data points that can be shared and should be shared for the benefit of the communities we serve.
Well, there are so many rich ideas there, right? Federation, which I think Busoya has already touched on, data as an asset or not, what the social bargain is. So I think we're going to spend some time diving into those. And I'll just give you a counterexample of a field where they think of data as an asset, and it's the human rights field. People go to the human rights field and says, well, you should turn over all of your data to Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. And people are stunned that the local groups don't want to do it, because actually almost the only asset of a local human rights group is the stories that they collect from people who have survived the human rights abuses. It's basically the only assets they have are the information they have, the data they have, and the people, the activists there. And so they tend to be, the incentives are not to share your data, because then your organization would cease to have a reason to exist. But you have to do some data sharing or it doesn't matter. And this trade-off is really tough. Now, Kristen, do you want to highlight, a real-life experience that you guys have had that's worked?
Yeah.
Mostly?
No. Yeah, no, I can do that. I just want to pick up on two things from Zainab as I go into that. One is this idea that, that people question what the incentives for sharing data would be. And honestly, I think that just demands a whole lot more courage from our institutions to think about the value of that data and the impact that it could have in terms of delivering against the reason that people say they do this work. And so for me, I feel like, yes, we're all competitors in different ways, and everyone's trying to make sure their institution survives. But I think when we zoom out and say, why did you get into this? It wasn't to do data entry as a health worker. It was to try to create opportunity. It was to try to create pathways for people who, from one circumstance or another, don't necessarily have what everyone deserves. And so to me, I think there's just a real opportunity, especially in moments like this, to demand that courage of ourselves. And so one of the things I think in terms of a concrete example of something that CARE is involved in with doing that is we are a founding member of something called the Dioptra Consortium. And this is a group of organizations that came together to really look at cost effectiveness. Because every one of us, well, frankly, most of us probably couldn't tell you project to project what the cost effectiveness of, we couldn't benchmark against our own work often, never mind other institutions. But if we were going to really try to understand how can you have the maximum impact per dollar invested, and this, this predates our current moment, but was no less important then. It's just, I think, even more important now. The only way to get there was to really find pathways to sharing information, to sharing data across institutions, to agreeing on what are the common sort of categories that we're going to use, how are we going to classify expenses, how are we going to quantify results, and how are we going to look at those across one another to understand not whether CARE is doing it better than Save the Children or Mercy Corps, or they're doing it better than us. Actually finding ways for that not to be what it was about was one of the critical points in success, was that this wasn't then going to be a race to the bottom. And I think we've all seen this, with the cash benchmarking, lots of organizations are like, it cost them $4, it cost me $2. Rather work with me, right? It was much more about, if we know things like cash transfers are effective, we know they have certain outcomes, what do we know about how to deliver multi-purpose cash as cost effectively as possible? What's the current standard, and how can we put rigor behind the analysis that really can stand up to scrutiny? Yeah. And so the consortium came together, they started working on this, and the truth is it took 2 years to get to the first data sharing moment.
Was that a legal issue?
No.
Political issue?
I have no doubt there were legal issues involved. It was, but at its core, I think it was working out the answer to some of those questions. What are the categories? How would we classify this? How would we classify this? Things like where does shared program costs get allocated in the model? And then how is the data sharing actually going to work? The trust issue and the risk issues. And building that trust across that group took a very long time. And they also decided to start with livelihoods. And they found out it's really hard to do cost effectiveness work in livelihoods because there's so much heterogeneity in what the inputs are and what the outcomes are and how people were measuring that. So that didn't really work. They then shifted to cash transfers, which is probably one of the clearest, like, I put cash in, what happens? Opportunities. And that was much more successful, and I think it helped the consortium build the muscles to have a practical success and a win on the board. But the current focus is now, how can we apply that same methodology with the same group on severe and acute malnutrition? So 500 million children are malnourished right now. And there's a certain amount of money going into work in the humanitarian space to affect change on that, to try to improve outcomes around that. And the group looked at UNICEF's data and their own data and realized we're about 20% of the funding in that space right now is represented within that consortium.
Wow.
And so they're saying we want to look at everybody's acute malnutrition programming side by side by side. And we want to understand what the current cost effectiveness of that work is and how can we drive it 20%. How can we get 20% more per dollar invested? How can we make a 20% shift in the cost effectiveness rate? So once we understand what it is, then we want to understand how do we improve on that by 20%, which means 500,000 more children are getting services. And that's why I sort of say, like, the incentives for sharing data to me, I really would challenge everyone to sort of expand the aperture and think about the consequences of not doing that.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I've seen people do about that issue of I'm cheaper than you for the same unit of social good is gathering all the data together and saying, they tell you what your measurement is according to this assay and what the average and the range was, but no one is allowed to actually go out there and say, you know, we were the low cost one. Did you guys come up with that kind of a design, or is
That's exactly where they landed.
Okay, all right.
That's exactly where they landed. And even so, in terms of the data storage, I think when I was mentioning to our colleagues here, the tech, I asked the woman who's leading a lot of this, and I said, you know, what technology underpins it? And she said, I have no idea. And to me, that's a success. The technologists know. It's all been worked out. But the users aren't preoccupied by where's the data stored. What they do know is our data is here, your data is a separate database that I can't see, and along the path. And then it's the overarching layer where the sort of anonymized data is visible. So you can see org 1, 2, 3, 4, but you can't associate it with any single institution.
Yeah, that's a great one. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, there was something you mentioned, Christian, which I think we would like to have a little bit more insight. With all the organizations we work with, one of the sensitivities we know is that you do compete against each other. And because of that sensitivity, data becomes a commodity that you can use to tell a story about why you should be the one that should get the funding. With shrinking funding, do you think that we're swimming against the tide? And sorry, I feel like I'm now taking up your job, but
No, I think this is where it really works well. Keep going.
but do you think we're going to be swimming against the tide to try and create a new paradigm of collaboration when we know that actually there is a lot of resource scarcity out there?
I don't know. I mean, I think our experience, I think there's a couple things. One is, one of the things we've learned is because it takes so much time, the opportunity cost of this kind of collaboration is very high. If you spend a year working towards one of these things and then the consortium can't get to that point of trust, you've wasted a year. And so being really thoughtful about where we're focusing that energy and on what issues, right? So it's saying things like, we're 20% of the humanitarian malnutrition funding. We should collectively, it's in everyone's benefit, both institutionally and just frankly for humanity, that we collaborate to figure out how to do that as effectively as possible. And I tend to be optimistic in that sense of Everyone's trying to solve these problems, and in this moment, it's really easy to try to close the walls and close the doors. My own hypothesis is that institutions that do that will not win, because others will be focused on the kinds of things that we're doing, which you can only do if you're working together. We can't benchmark across the industry if we're not doing it together. So,
You know, one observation I would make, often as a technologist who tries to serve, an entire field, we don't make that much headway with the chief executive, usually, with some rare exceptions. They're about fundraising, and so this does not advance this. But it's where the middle management, the people who actually have to run the programs, the people who are trying to do a better job, and trying to feed up impact numbers that actually win for the fundraising. It's usually there that I think we get the most traction of why are we working across purposes? We don't compete on the quality of our technology. We compete on our mission, our vision, our brand, and so anyway. And so Zeynep, I think one of the things that we kind of have touched on is sort of, we'll call it people versus technology, right? And there's some things that are like in the nature of technology. Sometimes the technology's crap, and you can't do anything with it. I think we identified some limitations on DHIS2, where it just doesn't kind of do that. So do you have some ideas about this sort of people versus the technology, and how, as we're talking about doing more data sharing, what we should keep in mind about things that will fundamentally not work and things that probably will work better? Do you have some ideas there?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is data that is useful for impact is hard to get by. It's not something that you can just buy or buy software and then it just works. So it really takes a lot of effort. It takes time. It takes investment. And sometimes that investment is really hard to justify. So it's about, again, it's about data literacy as well. So a lot of the middle management or even CEOs don't really understand what it takes to get data to the level that they needed for making decisions. So they just get, at the end of the year, a good report. They like the charts, they like the data, they like the facts, but they don't see the whole journey of the data. And so, and that effort is often down at the level of a few data scientists really, or data analysts struggling day to day to get that data to a level that it's acceptable to executive level. But it's for actually the operational level needs of data, we are still struggling. We don't have enough resources. So right now, with the technology allows that there is at least some sort of hope that AI can help bridge some of the gaps when it comes to data standardization. You can really use now, you can have dynamic data standardization that kind of bridges the gap between, let's all agree on some reference data, let's all agree on some standards. Now we can have an interpretation layer that solves some of those issues, but it still takes efforts and it still takes investment to get the technology to that level of impact, unfortunately.
And I think, and sometimes it's because the people who are involved are not very good at their jobs. I mean, we had a major AI, frankly, we had a major AI pilot with the Child Helpline movement, and one of the central things is you're supposed to track what the call was about, what the text was about. What was the child talk about on a schema that's based on child rights? And we tried to do an AI project across a bunch of helplines, and it turned out it didn't work at all. It didn't even work inside individual helplines, because the two different counselors would categorize the same call or text conversation differently. And it's impossible to have the AI automate something where the humans don't agree, right? Because you're training it on noise. And so sometimes it's bad technology, sometimes it's how people use the technology just as not amenable. Does that give you some more thoughts?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I want to ask the audience, how many nonprofits out here have data leadership at leadership level? No, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so it's very rare. And it's often because, again, we are still very slow at digital transformation in our sector. We have done a lot when it comes to systems that support HR, logistics, and finance, because it has compliance issues that we need to take care of. But when it comes actually to operational data or data that can help us become more effective, efficient, it takes time again, but efficiency is a word that I like to use sparingly. But it's really about, that kind of data is just not yet invested in, and especially not invested in a way that is outward facing, not inward facing. So there is a lot of investment that was happening on the digital transformation from an organization itself becoming more productive or more efficient, but not digital transformation that is sector-wide. There's looking at how can we serve the communities as best as we can. So how can we build digital systems that support that the effort outwards, not only inwards.
So my final big question is going to be basically about the social bargain. But do you guys want to talk about sort of people versus technology before we get there? The Zeynep's conversation. Okay, let's go. So go.
Yeah, the people angle I have found to be extremely important. Because when you work in different contexts with different organizations, with different governments, you're able to compare your experience when you're talking about data sharing. So example A, we've been working with this government for over 10 years. It was very easy. We were trusted. We could navigate, bringing partners together, talk about sharing. There was just something about trust that helped that conversation along. There was no second guessing. There wasn't high transaction cost. There wasn't, all this run around that you get with government sometimes. Fill that form, speak to that person, pass the file up. It was relatively easy and straightforward. Even though the first experience wasn't a raving success, they stuck with it until we got somewhere. Now, the other thing which I noticed is there was high retention in the ministry, which actually now I feel that might be shattered already, because people are moving around so long, and if it's taken a long time to invest in trust and people, and if the maximum number of years you're having with people is 1 or 2 years, then you're constantly trying to build trust, and it's not going to happen in the way that we had 10 years, same group of people, key people, working with, that's quite extraordinary. The second example is we knew the ministry, we'd worked with them for a little while, but it took us 18 months not to get a data sharing agreement, for them to even agree to talk about a data sharing agreement.
Oh, wow.
We had a conversation yesterday about having to work with government, and you just need to keep going, and you need to be patient, and I think that's actually what we did. But 18 months is a long time, especially when you're working in development or humanitarian context where there's short-termism. Your donor is not going to factor in the fact that it took 18 months to start the work because you already have deliverables in year 1, year 2. In the end, we got there, but I wish we had a way to fast-track human interaction and relationship to build trust very quickly without having to resort to legal contracts. Maybe this trust thing might actually help.
The miracle of no-cost extensions. Yeah. Krista, do you want to tackle people versus the tech, or you want to get on to our final question? What are you feeling?
I think I'm good.
You're good. Okay, so let's go to the final question. It's around the social bargain, right? The whole idea here is that it's you're not only talking to government and your NGO peers, but you're also talking to the communities that we serve. And so, how do you see making that social bargain that actually wins over, society, donors, because fundamentally, I don't feel most donors care, right? And so in some ways, how do we make them care about what we're going to be doing around data sharing and AI and these things that, they're paying more attention to AI, but they don't want to talk about data and technology. Okay, so what are your thoughts?
So I'm not sure if this is going to directly answer that, but
go for whatever you want to answer.
But yeah, people are definitely very interested in AI-based services, but they don't want to talk about the data requirements to get there, which is a tension I'm sure we're all grappling with. But I wanted to point to one other example, and it gets to kind of the social contract and a little bit of what you were talking about earlier in terms of data colonialism. So another example to your question of collaborate or compete. One of the things that, so Save the Children, CARE, and Mercy Corps, our CEOs got together in the midst of the stop work order mayhem a year ago, and basically recognized very quickly that there's got to be stuff that we could be doing together that would make us better, and frankly, better fit for purpose for the universe we're now going into. And so they came together and I think there were 80-something ideas up on a wall that turned into 7, which turned into an email, which landed on my desk. And 6 other desks of we think there's something here. But one of those was an acknowledgement that our institutions, and I think our sector, is not radically obsessed with participant, and I hate these words. Like the vocabulary we have is horrific. But the people we work with, the communities we work in, obsessed with how they're doing, what they're feeling, what they need, and what they think we could be doing differently. We're not obsessed with it in the way that we should be and in the way that the private sector is about their customers. And so that was one point where they said, we want to get better at that. None of us are good at it. Let's figure out if we can get better at it together. So the leadership impetus, I think, was there, and the clarity that this was data was going to be part of what had to happen here was clear. But we are right now in the messy middle of the reality is when you get 3-4 layers down, you're like, okay, but we have this system, we have that system, we already do some of this, we don't do some of that, you do it this way, I do it that way. Are we building one data platform? Which we are not. Which we are not. But I'm confident that there are things that we can do now that are different, leveraging technology. And so there is a technology component to it. And in some conversations, it really helps to amplify that. This is all about AI-driven analysis of voice, text, voice to text and all of this. And in other conversations, it's much more important to talk about, this is about reciprocity and about what data are we asking of, soliciting in the first place, and who decides that? And then how are we bringing back the insights that generate so that communities actually have ownership and ability to do with it whatever they may do. But that's just a practical example of, I think, where we're trying to live into a more...
It's a super big point. Businesses, by and large, are obsessed with customer satisfaction. And we have the technology to do quality control on our services, automated support, training, highlighting the low performers and improving their... We have ways of asking directly to our constituents, would you use this service again? What about the worker that you worked with? And most organizations don't enable those functions even if they're available. But anyway, we're down to our last few minutes. So, what about that social bargain and sort of your closing thoughts on data sharing? Make the case.
Yes, when I think about it, I think about diagnostics and the targeted value proposition that goes with that field. And in my experience, what I found is if you think about diagnostics in the laboratories, a lot of the work is manual, so you do the diagnostics, there's somebody who writes the data, and then that data goes up the chain to the ministry, to the epidemiology department, and then the manufacturers are also trying to get some read into what's happening with their devices, how many failed, how many online, offline. And I think with the solution we're able to bring, you do passive recording of the data. So you take the data from the device itself. That's a target value proposition for value add for the laboratory assistant clinician who doesn't need to do that anymore because that data is then just transmitted automatically from the device or any Internet of Things device. So that's number one. Number two, you're then able to split the data. They call it type 1 and type 2 data. So the health data automatically gets transmitted to the Ministry of Health without question, and then the device data gets transmitted to the manufacturers. Again, everything is automated. And there is this social contract between all the parties involved that they know exactly who's getting what and who's not seeing what. And we're the middle people, the middle organization that is curating that process. And I think that sharing has worked really well. And I think over 3,000 devices that we've connected in over 9 countries, and some of them in high-income countries. So that has worked pretty well, and I see technology playing a big part there. And so that would be my
that's great.
My case for it.
So is it your final ideas?
Yeah, just a final word on the social contract. In the philosophy of how we're building CLEAR, we're looking at data sovereignty from an individual level. So the individual being that person that we are hoping to support, who has just been affected by disaster. And so we are taking this data sovereignty really down to that level, and that really abstracts that data ownership away from, I collected that data, so I'm the owner of the data as an organization, but really bringing it back down to the fact that we collected that data to support that individual, and that's the cause we're all working towards, so that creates incentives for every organization that's collecting data about that individual to share the data around it. Yeah.
Well, I think this has been an amazing panel. I hope that you enjoyed it. We got people who are actually doing this, wrestling with it, working with their competitors, working with their customers, trying to set these ethics, trying to do the social bargain around data sharing. And I think that they've really made the case that this is imperative, but it's not easy. So thank you very much to our panel, and thank you for your attention.